The asphalt is still warm from the day's heat when Sarah Chen first notices it. 2:15 in the morning, walking home from her shift at the all-night diner on South Street, and there it is, embedded directly into the intersection of 15th and Locust. A linoleum tile, about the size of a paperback book, pressed flush with the asphalt. The streetlight above flickers once, twice, and in that unstable orange glow, she reads words that make absolutely no sense. Toynbee idea. In movie, 2011. Resurrected. On planet Jupiter Tarak. London. She crouches down, touching the letters with her fingertips. The tile is real. The letters are real. Someone carved this message, created this tile, and somehow installed it into the middle of a Philadelphia street. But why? And more unsettling when she walks this route 5 nights a week, and she swears it wasn't here yesterday. Sarah doesn't know it yet, but she's just become part of something that will haunt amateur investigators, journalists, and obsessed researchers for more than 3 decades. She's found one tile. There are hundreds of others, scattered across Philadelphia, spreading through Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, crossing the border into South America, Santiago, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro. Always the same cryptic message, always embedded in asphalt at major intersections, always installed in secret, under cover of darkness, by someone who has remained invisible for decades. The message references Stanley Kubrick's film, 2001, A Space Odyssey. It mentions Arnold Toynbee, a British historian who wrote about the rise and fall of civilizations. It promises resurrection on Jupiter. It sounds like the ravings of someone unhinged, except for one disturbing detail. Whoever is doing this has the dedication, the resources, and the skill to install hundreds of these tiles across 2 continents without ever being caught. This isn't random graffiti. This is a mission, an obsession, a decades-long project that someone believes is important enough to risk arrest, to spend countless nights in the streets, to devote their entire life to spreading this bizarre message. By 1994, the tiles have become urban legend in Philadelphia. People collect sightings like trading cards. Reporters write novelty pieces for local papers. But nobody can answer the fundamental questions. Who is doing this? How are they doing it? And what could possibly drive someone to this level of obsessive, secretive dedication? The tiles offer no signature, no contact information, no explanation beyond the cryptic message itself. Just the words, pressed into the street, waiting to be driven over by thousands of cars, walked over by thousands of pedestrians who never look down. Then, in the late 90s, something changes. New tiles appear, and these ones are different. Longer, angrier, rambling manifestos about media conspiracies, about journalists who supposedly destroyed the tiler's life, about enemies and persecution. The messages grow paranoid, accusatory. This isn't just eccentric anymore. There's rage here. Fear. The sense that whoever is creating these tiles believes themselves to be under attack, believes the world is conspiring against them. The mystery that seemed quirky, almost charming in its strangeness, suddenly feels darker, more disturbing. For years, the tiles remain unsolved. The ultimate urban mystery. Then, in 2006, 3 filmmakers with cameras and an obsession of their own decide they're going to crack this case open. They're going to find the tiler. They're going to answer the questions that have consumed Philadelphia for decades. What they discover will be stranger, sadder, and more human than anyone expected. The story behind the tiles isn't about aliens or grand conspiracies or mystical resurrections on Jupiter. It's about loneliness, mental illness, and the desperate human need to be heard, to matter, to leave some mark on the world that proves we existed at all. The asphalt had already swallowed it halfway. That was what bothered James Marasco the most when he first spotted the thing, embedded in the middle of South Street, in Philadelphia sometime in the early 1980s. Not the cryptic message itself, not the strange quality of the linoleum-like material pressed into the road surface, but the fact that it was clearly designed to be run over, to be destroyed. Most street art demanded attention, screened for preservation. This was different. This wanted to be crushed beneath tires, ground down by the endless procession of cars and buses and delivery trucks that rolled through Center City every single day. Marasco stopped his morning jog, hands on his knees, catching his breath in the autumn air. The tile measured roughly the size of a license plate, maybe a bit larger, its letters carved or pressed into layers of what looked like linoleum and tar paper. The words were laid out in a crude, almost typewriter-like font, all capitals, slightly uneven. He read them once, then twice, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Toynbee idea in movie 2001, Resurrected Dead on Planet Jupiter. The lowercase I in movie struck him as particularly odd, like a typo in stone, a permanent mistake that someone had decided to immortalize in the middle of a Philadelphia street. He stood there for several minutes, waiting to see if anyone else would stop, if anyone else would acknowledge this strange thing. Cars drove over it without slowing. A woman walking her dog passed by without a glance. Marasco eventually continued his run, but the message stuck with him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It felt like overhearing half of a conversation in a language you almost understood. He wasn't the only one noticing them. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, other Philadelphians began encountering similar tiles embedded in streets throughout the city. A graphic designer named Sarah Chen found one on her walk to the subway station on Market Street. A taxi driver named William Rodriguez saw 3 in a single shift, scattered across different neighborhoods. Each tile bore the same cryptic message, with only minor variations in spacing or layout. Nobody seemed to know where they came from or who was placing them. This was Philadelphia in the 1980s, a city still finding its footing after decades of industrial decline. The streets were rough, potholed, perpetually under construction or in need of it. It wasn't entirely unusual to see weird stuff embedded in the pavement. Construction crews sometimes left odd marks, utility companies painted mysterious symbols, kids with spray cans tagged everything from bridges to trash cans. But these tiles were different. They required planning, materials, effort. Someone was going to significant trouble to plant messages that most people would never even notice. The pre-internet era meant that discoveries like this existed in isolation. Chen mentioned the tile to coworkers, who shrugged. Rodriguez told stories at the taxi stand, where other drivers claimed to have seen similar things, but nobody thought to document it systematically. Marasco eventually stopped talking about his sighting after too many blank stares and polite nods. In 1987 or 1988, there was no Reddit thread to post mysterious findings, no Instagram to share strange photographs, no way for scattered observations to suddenly coalesce into a recognized pattern. You saw something weird, you told your friends, and unless they saw it too, that's where the story ended. But then the tiles started appearing in New York City. A journalist named Marcus Thompson was covering the story in the Garment District in 1989, when he spotted one embedded in the intersection of 7th Avenue and 39th Street. He had lived in New York for 15 years, and prided himself on noticing details most people missed. This thing, though, this had clearly been there for a while, weathered and tire-scarred, and he had walked past this exact corner dozens of times without seeing it. The message was identical to the Philadelphia versions, though Thompson had no way of knowing that. Toynbee idea in movie 2001, Resurrect Dead on Planet Jupiter tour. Thompson's journalistic instincts kicked in. He took photographs, made notes, started asking questions. The super of a nearby building claimed it had been there for at least 2 years. A hot dog vendor said he'd never noticed it before. A traffic cop shrugged and said people stick all kinds of crazy stuff in the streets. Thompson pitched a story to his editor, who politely declined, suggesting it was probably just some art student's project and not worth column space. Throughout the early 1990s, the sightings multiplied. Boston, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. Each city reported the same strange tiles appearing in high-traffic intersections, always embedded directly into the asphalt, always bearing variations of the same message. A school teacher in Boston named Patricia Levine photographed one near her apartment in 1992 and showed it to her class as an example of urban mysteries. Her students found it fascinating and creepy in equal measure. What did it mean? Was Toynbee a person, a place, a concept? Why the movie 2001? Stanley Kubrick's film had been released more than 20 years earlier. Why Jupiter? Why resurrection? The mental illness theory emerged early and persisted. Many assumed these tiles were the work of someone deeply unwell, someone whose fractured thinking produced this cryptic message that felt meaningful without actually meaning anything coherent. The obsessive repetition, the strange formatting, the grandiose themes of resurrection and space travel, combined with the mundane medium of street tiles. All of it suggested a mind untethered from consensus reality. Some people found this explanation comforting. It transformed the mystery into a sad story about mental health rather than something more unsettling. Others weren't so sure. The tiles required technical skill. Someone had to create them, transport them, install them in the middle of busy streets without getting caught. This wasn't random scrawling or delusional rambling spray-painted on a wall. This was sustained, methodical, successful guerrilla installation, art or communication that had been ongoing for years, possibly decades, across multiple major cities. That required planning, resources, and a level of operational security that seemed incompatible with severe mental illness. The art installation theory had its adherents too. Maybe this was performance art, some Andy Warhol disciple making a statement about media, meaning, and urban life. The incomprehensibility could be the point. The slow discovery, the grassroots spread of awareness, the mystery itself might be the artwork. But if so, why no claim of credit? Artists, especially ambitious ones, generally wanted recognition. Anonymous art existed, but this felt different. This felt like communication, like someone was trying to say something specific, even if nobody could quite figure out what. By the mid-1990s, enough people had noticed enough tiles that informal networks of awareness began to form. A handful of newspaper articles appeared, usually buried in local interest sections, treating the tiles as quirky urban phenomena. A call-in radio show in Philadelphia devoted a segment to them, with listeners sharing sightings and theories. Someone claimed to have found a tile in Kansas City. Another caller insisted they'd seen one in South America, though this seemed unlikely and was never verified. The slow accumulation of data points revealed something increasingly undeniable. This wasn't random. This wasn't isolated incidents in a few neighboring cities. This was a campaign, vast in scope and duration, executed with remarkable consistency by an unknown person or group who had been doing this for years without detection. The implications were both fascinating and deeply strange. Someone had dedicated possibly decades of their life to embedding cryptic messages in streets across America and possibly beyond. Someone was trying to communicate something urgent enough to justify enormous effort, but had chosen the most oblique, fragile method imaginable. The tiles degraded quickly under traffic. Most lasted only a few years before being reduced to unreadable fragments. This meant that whoever made them had to keep making more continuously to maintain their presence. It was Sisyphean labor, creating messages designed to be destroyed, then creating more to replace them. The psychology of it was haunting. What drove someone to this? What message was so important that it justified such futile, endless effort? For those who discovered the tiles in those pre-internet years, the experience carried a particular quality of isolation and wonder. You stumbled upon something genuinely mysterious, something that suggested hidden depths to the ordinary streets you walked every day. You couldn't Google it and instantly find explanations. You couldn't crowdsource theories or compare notes with thousands of other observers. You were alone with the mystery, or nearly so, left to wonder if you were seeing something significant or just projecting meaning onto random urban debris. The phrase itself became a kind of mantra for some observers. Toynbee idea, in movie 2001, Resurrect Dead on planet Jupiter. The words rolled together, almost poetic in their strangeness. People would repeat them, trying them out, seeing if speaking the phrase aloud revealed any hidden significance. It never did, but the mystery deepened with repetition rather than fading. Every word felt like it should mean something. The Arnold Toynbee connection was eventually made by people familiar with the British historian who wrote about the rise and fall of civilizations. But how did his ideas connect to Kubrick's film? How did either relate to resurrection on Jupiter? By 1999, as the millennium approached, perhaps a few hundred people scattered across the eastern United States had become actively aware of the tiles, compared notes, developed theories. This was just before widespread internet adoption would transform how mysteries propagated and were investigated. The Toynbee Tiles existed in that liminal moment, when a mystery could still unfold slowly, accumulating witnesses and speculation over years rather than hours. Those early observers were pioneers of sorts, detectives without forensic tools, researchers without databases. They walked their cities looking down instead of straight ahead, checking intersections, documenting with disposable cameras, building files in shoeboxes rather than cloud storage. They were chasing something they couldn't quite name, pulled forward by the same compulsion that drove the tile maker, the need to find pattern and meaning in the chaos of urban life. To believe that strange messages pressed into asphalt might contain some truth worth discovering. Walking the streets of any major American city, you might glance down and see something unusual embedded in the asphalt. A linoleum tile, carefully placed, bearing a cryptic message that reads, "Toynbee idea, in Kubrick's 2001, Resurrect Dead, on planet Jupiter." These strange artifacts have appeared in dozens of cities over decades, mysterious breadcrumbs left by an unknown hand, each one a fragment of an elaborate philosophical puzzle that seems to pull from the deepest wells of 20th century thought. But what kind of mind would weave together an obscure British historian, a landmark science fiction film, and an urgent message about bringing the dead back to life, then stamp it into the pavement for strangers to find? To understand the intellectual architecture of these tiles, you have to begin with Arnold Joseph Toynbee, a name that once commanded tremendous respect in academic circles, but has largely faded from popular consciousness. Born in 1889, Toynbee devoted his life to understanding the grand patterns of human civilization. His 12-volume masterwork, A Study of History, published between 1934 and 1961, proposed a revolutionary framework for understanding how societies rise, flourish, and ultimately collapse. Unlike his predecessors who saw history as a linear march of progress, or a random series of events, Toynbee identified cyclical patterns that repeated across different cultures and epochs. Toynbee's central thesis revolved around the concept of challenge and response. Civilizations, he argued, emerge when human communities face environmental, social, or spiritual challenges that force them to innovate and organize. The creative minority within these societies develops solutions, establishing the institutions and values that define a culture. But here's where Toynbee's theory takes a darker turn. Every civilization eventually reaches a point where its creative minority becomes a dominant minority, clinging to outdated solutions and suppressing new ideas. The society loses its flexibility, its ability to respond to new challenges. Internal proletariats rebel, external proletariats invade, and the civilization enters a time of troubles that often ends in disintegration. Yet Toynbee didn't see this collapse as the end of the story. He was deeply influenced by religious and mystical thinking, and he believed that civilizations could experience periods of withdrawal and return, moments when prophetic figures or movements could revitalize a dying culture through spiritual renewal. The death of a civilization might give birth to a universal church or a philosophical system that would seed the next cycle of human organization. Death and resurrection, collapse and rebirth. These weren't just metaphors for Toynbee. They were the fundamental rhythms of human history, playing out on a scale that dwarfed individual human lives. Now consider Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, released in 1968, and based on a story by Arthur C. Clarke. On its surface, it's a science fiction film about astronauts, artificial intelligence, and a mysterious alien artifact. But Kubrick and Clarke embedded layers of philosophical meaning into every frame. The film opens with apes struggling for survival at the dawn of humanity. A black monolith appears, an artifact of incomprehensible intelligence, and suddenly the apes learn to use tools, to kill, to organize. Millions of years pass in a single edit, and humanity has spread to the moon, where another monolith waits, deliberately buried, sending a signal toward Jupiter. The astronaut Dave Bowman travels to Jupiter, passing through a psychedelic gateway of light and color that suggests transformation beyond human comprehension. He ages rapidly in an ornate room, a soul passing through the stations of life. And finally, he's reborn as the Star Child, a luminous fetus floating in space, gazing at Earth with eyes that suggest both innocence and terrifying knowledge. Clark later confirmed that this was meant to represent humanity's next evolutionary leap, engineered by vast alien intelligences who seed the cosmos with monoliths, guiding promising species toward transcendence. The parallels to Toynbee's framework are striking. The apes represent humanity in its primitive state, facing existential challenges. The monolith serves as the catalyst for transformation, the external force that provokes a response. Human civilization rises, develops technology, reaches for the stars. But the film also shows the sterility and bureaucracy of future humanity, the dead conversations and corporate doublespeak, suggesting a civilization that has lost its vital spark. HAL 9000, the ship's artificial intelligence, represents the dominant minority taken to its logical extreme, an entity so committed to its programmed mission that it murders the crew to preserve its objective. And finally, through death and dissolution comes rebirth. Bowman dies as a human and returns as something transcendent, carrying the promise of renewal. But there's another piece to this puzzle, one that directly connects these ideas to the name stamped on those mysterious tiles. In 1984, Ray Bradbury published a short story called The Toynbee Convector, a tale about deception, hope, and the power of myth to shape human destiny. The story features a time traveler named Craig Bennett Stiles, who in the year 1984 reveals that he never actually traveled to the future. His famous journey 100 years forward, his glowing reports of a utopian future where humanity had solved its problems and achieved enlightenment. It was all an elaborate hoax. He created props, faked evidence, and broadcast inspirational messages about the wonderful world that awaited in the 21st century. Why would he perpetrate such a fraud? Because Stiles believed humanity was on the brink of self-destruction, paralyzed by pessimism and nuclear dread. People needed hope, a vision of a positive future to work toward. So he constructed one. He became what he called a Toynbee Convector, a device to transport civilization away from despair and toward renewal. The name was deliberate. Bradbury was invoking Arnold Toynbee's theories, suggesting that sometimes civilizations need a prophetic lie, a compelling myth strong enough to inspire the creative response that prevents collapse. The story asks uncomfortable questions about the relationship between truth and survival, between honest despair and necessary fiction. Now imagine a mind that has absorbed all of these narratives. Someone who has read Toynbee's dense historical analysis and internalized its message about civilizational death and rebirth. Someone who has watched 2001 multiple times, parsing its symbolism, understanding it as a roadmap for human transcendence. Someone who has encountered Bradbury's story and recognized it as a key that unlocks the others. This person sees patterns that others miss. They understand that humanity is in crisis, that our civilization shows all the signs of Toynbee's time of troubles. The dominant minority clings to power. Creative responses are suppressed. We teeter on the edge of collapse. But this person also believes in the possibility of resurrection, of rebirth on a cosmic scale. They've connected Jupiter, the destination in Kubrick's film where transformation occurs, with the idea that the dead can be literally resurrected, brought back through some process that mirrors the rebirth of civilization. Perhaps they interpret the film's ending not as metaphor, but as prophecy, a genuine prediction about humanity's future evolution. Perhaps they believe that Kubrick and Clark were themselves acting as Toynbee convectors, embedding messages about humanity's true destiny within the framework of entertainment. And here's where the tiles become more unsettling, because many of them contain additional text, fragmentary accusations that reveal a darker current beneath the philosophical speculation. Some tiles mention that the media is involved in suppression, that powerful forces are hiding the truth about resurrection, about Jupiter, about humanity's next stage. The tiler, whoever they are, isn't just sharing an abstract theory. They believe they've uncovered a conspiracy, a deliberate effort to keep the masses ignorant of their transcendent potential. This is the point where intellectual synthesis crosses into paranoid mythology. The person creating these tiles isn't simply making art or exploring ideas. They're constructing an elaborate belief system, one that explains why their revelations haven't been accepted, why no one else seems to grasp the connections they've made. The media becomes the villain in this narrative, the force that maintains the status quo, that prevents the creative minority from emerging, that keeps humanity trapped in its dying civilization, rather than allowing the transformation that leads to rebirth. Consider the method of transmission itself. These tiles are embedded in streets, placed illegally under cover of darkness, positioned where thousands of people will walk over them, but only a few will notice. There's something deeply paranoid about this approach, the belief that truth must be smuggled into public space because normal channels of communication are compromised. It's guerrilla philosophy, street-level prophecy from someone who feels excluded from legitimate forums of discourse. The worldview embedded in these tiles reflects a pattern common to many conspiracy theories and fringe belief systems. It takes genuine intellectual work, real reading, and synthesis, and pushes it one step further into territory that most people would consider delusional. Yes, Toynbee wrote about civilizational cycles. Yes, 2001 explores themes of transcendence. Yes, Bradbury's story is about using myth to inspire hope. But the tiles assert something more, an urgent claim that these aren't just interesting ideas but suppressed truths about humanity's immediate future. There's a particular kind of isolation in this worldview, a loneliness that comes from believing you've glimpsed a pattern that the rest of humanity is too blind or too controlled to see. The tiler becomes a prophet without a congregation, leaving messages for a future audience who will finally understand, who will finally see the connections and recognize the truth. Each tile is an act of faith that meaning exists, that the pattern is real, that the dead will be resurrected on planet Jupiter, and that this glorious transformation is being deliberately hidden by forces that benefit from keeping humanity in darkness. In the early 2000s, 3 filmmakers in Philadelphia made a decision that would consume the next 7 years of their lives. John Foy, a first-time director, along with producers Colin Smith and Steve Weinig, became obsessed with solving a mystery that had haunted city sidewalks for decades. The Toynbee Tiles, those cryptic linoleum plaques embedded in asphalt across multiple cities, had existed as urban background noise for years. But for these 3 men, what began as casual curiosity transformed into an all-consuming investigation that would test their sanity, drain their bank accounts, and reveal a mystery far darker than they ever imagined. The filmmakers stumbled into the mystery the way most people did, by walking over a tile without noticing it, then doubling back when something registered in their peripheral vision. This particular tile sat at the intersection of 14th and Chestnut in Philadelphia, a busy corner where thousands of feet pass daily. The message was the familiar refrain about Toynbee and resurrecting the dead on Jupiter, but something about its handmade quality, its mysterious placement, struck Foy as profoundly strange. Who would go through such elaborate effort for such an incomprehensible message? The question wouldn't let him go. What the filmmakers didn't know at the start was that they were stepping into a mystery already 2 decades old, one that had baffled urban explorers, journalists, and amateur investigators since the mid-1980s. But they had something previous investigators lacked: time, resources, and the kind of obsessive personality that would allow them to dedicate years to tracking down a mystery with no guarantee of answers. Their investigation began simply enough. They photographed every tile they could find in Philadelphia, creating a database of locations and messages. Each tile was slightly different. Some were pristine, newly laid, and clear. Others were worn almost to illegibility, ground down by years of traffic until only fragments remained. The filmmakers noticed that the tiles appeared in high-traffic intersections, places where asphalt was regularly resurfaced, which meant the tiler had to work quickly during road construction. This wasn't graffiti sprayed in the night. This required planning, timing, and a knowledge of municipal roadwork that suggested genuine expertise. As they documented the Philadelphia tiles, they began researching online communities that had formed around the mystery. Amateur enthusiasts had been tracking the tiles for years, posting sightings on message boards and forums. What shocked the filmmakers was the geographic scope. These tiles weren't just in Philadelphia. They appeared in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., New York, Boston. Then the reports got stranger. There were tiles in Cleveland, Kansas City, St. Louis. Witnesses claimed to have found them in Santiago, Chile, and several cities in Brazil. The tiler had covered thousands of miles across 2 continents. The filmmakers decided to map every known tile, creating what would become the most comprehensive database of Toynbee tile locations ever assembled. They drove up and down the eastern seaboard, cameras in hand, documenting tiles in various states of decay. In some cities, only fragments remained. In others, fresh tiles had appeared recently, which meant the creator was still active, still laying tiles somewhere in the world. It was during this mapping phase that they noticed something disturbing. The newer tiles, the ones that appeared to have been placed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, contained different messages. The original tiles had been strange but relatively benign, their messages about resurrection and Jupiter cryptic but not threatening. The newer tiles told a different story. These tiles mentioned NBC specifically, claiming the network was part of a conspiracy. The messages accused journalists of murder plots, of targeting the tile creator personally, of trying to prevent the spread of his message. One tile they found in Baltimore read, "Murder every journalist, I beg you. NBC employees are the guilty ones." The shift in tone was jarring, unmistakable. Where the original messages had been weird philosophy or science fiction speculation, these newer tiles dripped with paranoia and rage. The filmmakers photographed each one carefully, noting the locations and dates they were likely placed based on road construction records. The messages became more specific and more disturbing. Some tiles referenced particular NBC employees by name. Others made vague threats or claimed that enemies were closing in. The filmmakers realized they were documenting not just a mystery, but a mental deterioration, a slow psychological unraveling preserved in linoleum and asphalt. Someone was creating these tiles in a state of increasing fear and anger, and they had been doing so for decades without anyone knowing their identity. The investigation took on a new urgency. Who was this person? What had happened to them? And were they dangerous? The filmmakers began interviewing anyone who might have information. They tracked down urban explorers who had been photographing tiles since the 1980s. They found amateur radio enthusiasts who remembered strange calls in the 1980s and 90s from someone rambling about Toynbee and resurrection. They spoke with road construction workers, city planners, asphalt companies. Slowly, impossibly slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Multiple witnesses remembered a man calling into talk radio shows in Philadelphia throughout the 1980s. The calls were rambling, incoherent, always returning to the same themes. The ideas of historian Arnold Toynbee, the science fiction of Arthur C. Clarke, the possibility of resurrecting the dead through molecular reconstitution on Jupiter. The caller's voice was described as quiet, nervous, difficult to understand. Some hosts engaged with him politely. Others mocked him on air, laughing at his strange theories and encouraging callers to make fun of him. One former radio producer remembered a caller who fit the description, someone who phoned in regularly to a particular late-night show. The host had given the caller airtime initially, intrigued by the novelty, but eventually banned him when the calls became too repetitive and strange. The producer couldn't remember the caller's name, but remembered the host making jokes about him after he hung up, turning him into a running gag for listeners. This detail hit the filmmakers hard. They realized they might be looking at a tragedy. Someone lonely and isolated, someone with unusual ideas, had reached out through public radio only to be mocked and humiliated. That rejection might have driven him deeper into isolation, into a world where his only communication became these cryptic tiles embedded in city streets where no one could interrupt or laugh at him. The filmmakers spent months tracking down radio archives, listening to hundreds of hours of talk shows from Philadelphia stations in the 1980s and early 90s. The work was tedious beyond measure. Most shows were an archive. Those that were existed on deteriorating cassette tapes in storage facilities or private collections. But finally, they found it. A recording from a show in the mid-1980s featuring a caller whose voice, shaky and soft, discussed Toynbee's theories about bringing the dead back to life. The caller mentioned Jupiter, mentioned Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey, mentioned resurrection. It was him. They had found the voice behind the tiles, but having the voice didn't give them the name. The caller never identified himself. The host never used a name. They were closer but still missing the crucial piece, identity. The investigation consumed their lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. Boy stopped taking other work, dedicating himself full-time to solving the mystery, even though he had no funding for a documentary and no guarantee anyone would care about the result. Smith and Wynick balanced the investigation with their jobs, spending evenings and weekends driving to distant cities to photograph tiles, conducting interviews, following leads that often went nowhere. Their friends and families grew concerned. How long would they chase this? What were they hoping to find? Even the filmmakers couldn't fully answer. The mystery had a gravitational pull that defied rational explanation. Every new tile discovery, every witness interview, every small revelation created a compulsion to know more, to dig deeper, to finally put a name and face to the person behind this decades-long enigma. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman contacted them after hearing about their investigation through an online forum. She claimed to have been neighbors with a man in South Philadelphia who might be connected to the tiles. He was a recluse, she said, never left his house except at odd hours, always seemed nervous and suspicious. She had once seen linoleum sheets and tarps in his driveway. The description was vague, but it was the most concrete lead they had received. The filmmakers staked out the address, sitting in their car on the quiet residential street, watching the house for hours. They felt ridiculous, like amateur detectives in a crime film, but they had come too far to ignore any possibility. On the third day, an elderly man emerged from the house briefly to retrieve his mail. They couldn't approach him then, weren't ready, but they photographed him from a distance and began researching property records, utility bills, any documentation that might confirm this was their person. As they dug deeper into this potential lead, they continued mapping the tiles and discovered something chilling. The most recent tiles, those from the early 2000s, showed signs of severe mental disturbance. The messages were increasingly fragmented, accusations flying in multiple directions. NBC, the government, journalists, neighbors, all were accused of being part of the conspiracy. Some tiles suggested the creator believed he was being followed, watched, targeted for elimination because of the truths he was trying to communicate. The filmmakers realized they were witnessing the documentation of paranoid delusion, preserved in permanent form across city streets. Each tile was a snapshot of deteriorating mental health, a cry for help that no one heard because no one knew who was crying. The investigation stopped being about solving a quirky urban mystery. It became about understanding a human being who had spent decades in isolation, fear, and possibly mental illness, communicating through the only medium he felt was safe from interference. The weight of this realization affected all three filmmakers differently. Boy became even more determined to find the creator, believing that telling his story might bring some dignity to a life spent in shadows. Smith worried they were exploiting someone vulnerable, that making a documentary about a potentially mentally ill person was ethically questionable. Wynick wanted answers, but questioned whether they had the right to intrude on someone who had clearly chosen anonymity. These tensions simmered as they pushed forward, the mystery pulling them along, even as they questioned their own motives. They had documented hundreds of tiles, interviewed dozens of witnesses, assembled a timeline spanning 30 years and 2 continents. They were closer than anyone had ever been to identifying the Toynbee Tiler. But they also understood, with increasing clarity, that finding the answer might reveal something heartbreaking rather than triumphant, something that would complicate their documentary and challenge their assumptions about what they were really searching for in those cryptic messages embedded in city streets across the world. In the heart of South Philadelphia on Hellerman Street, there lived a man who existed on the periphery of human society, a ghost in his own neighborhood. His name was Severino di Giambattista Verna, though those few who knew him at all called him Sevi. He was an unremarkable figure in many ways, a social security worker who processed paperwork and claims in a government office downtown, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. But beneath this veneer of bureaucratic normalcy churned something far more complex, a mind consumed by ideas so grand and so strange that they would eventually transform him from invisible civil servant into the architect of one of America's most peculiar artistic mysteries. Sevi Verna was born in 1923, entering a world on the cusp of modernity, of radio broadcasts and automobile culture, of urban sprawl and increasing disconnection. By the time investigators and curious journalists began piecing together his identity as the likely creator of the Toynbee Tiles, he was already an elderly man, weathered by decades of profound isolation. His life had become something other than what most people would recognize as living. It had transformed into a mission, an obsession that consumed every spare moment, every dollar, every ounce of creative energy he possessed. The breakthrough in identifying Verna came through patient detective work by documentary filmmakers and amateur researchers who refused to let the mystery rest. They combed through decades of Philadelphia Inquirer letters to the editor, searching for any mention of Toynbee or Jupiter or resurrection. And there, buried in the archives, they found them. Strange, rambling letters submitted by Severino Verna, dating back to the 1980s and even earlier. These letters revealed a mind grappling with big questions, cosmic questions about humanity's purpose and destiny. They spoke of Arnold Toynbee's theories of history, of Stanley Kubrick's film, 2001, A Space Odyssey, of the possibility that dead molecules might be resurrected on the planet Jupiter. The language was passionate but scattered, the logic often difficult to follow. These were the writings of someone trying desperately to communicate ideas that felt vitally important, but which existed just beyond the reach of coherent expression. When researchers began connecting these letters to the tiles appearing on Philadelphia streets, the pieces started falling into place. But confirmation came from something more tangible than archival documents. It came from witnesses, from neighbors, from people who had seen something strange happening in the dead of night. Multiple witnesses reported seeing an older man, someone matching Verna's description, working on Philadelphia streets in the darkest hours before dawn. They described a solitary figure, hunched over the pavement, installing what appeared to be signs or plaques directly into the asphalt. The man worked quickly, methodically, always alone. He drove an old Dodge sedan, its trunk loaded with materials. The car itself became a signature, distinctive enough that several people remembered seeing it parked at odd angles on various streets, always in the middle of the night, always with that same elderly man nearby, bent over his work. One neighbor reported watching from her window as Verna installed a tile just a few houses down from where he lived. She described the surreal quality of the scene, this old man working with such intense focus at 3 a.m, placing his creation into a patch of fresh asphalt as if he were performing some sacred ritual. She noted that he never looked around, never seemed concerned about being observed. He was completely absorbed in his task, in a trance state where nothing existed except the message he was embedding into the street. Others who lived on Hellerman Street painted a picture of a man who had withdrawn almost completely from human society. Verna rarely spoke to his neighbors. He kept irregular hours. His house, a modest row home indistinguishable from dozens of others on the block, had an abandoned quality even when he was living there. The curtains remained drawn. No visitors ever came. No one could remember the last time they had seen him engaged in normal neighborly interaction, borrowing a tool, or commenting on the weather. He had become a phantom in plain sight, present but not participating, alive but disconnected from the web of small connections that makes a neighborhood feel like a community. Former coworkers from the Social Security Administration remembered him as quiet and competent, but increasingly withdrawn as the years passed. He did his work adequately, processing claims and paperwork without complaint, but he never joined colleagues for lunch or after-work drinks. He never mentioned family, hobbies, or interests. During breaks, while others chatted or read the newspaper, Verna would sometimes pull out notebooks and write furiously, covering pages with dense text that no one ever got close enough to read. Looking back, these coworkers realized they had worked alongside him for years without ever really knowing him, without penetrating the wall of isolation he had built around himself. The tiles themselves revealed the methodology of his obsession. Researchers who examined them closely determined that they were constructed from layers of linoleum flooring, the kind you might buy at any hardware store. Verna would cut the letters and words from different colored linoleum, arranging them to create his message. These pieces were then adhered to a backing using a combination of tar paper and powerful adhesive, creating a flexible but durable composite. The finished tile was relatively thin, light enough for one person to transport and install alone. The installation process required timing and opportunity. Verna appeared to monitor road construction and maintenance throughout Philadelphia and beyond, learning where fresh asphalt would be laid. He would wait until the work crews had finished for the day, but before the asphalt had completely hardened, a narrow window of time usually occurring late at night. Then he would arrive with his tile, press it firmly into the still soft surface, and disappear before dawn. The asphalt, as it finished curing, would grip the edges of the tile, locking it in place. Traffic and weather would do the rest, embedding it further, making it seem as permanent as the street itself. This methodology spoke to careful planning and dedication. Creating even a single tile required hours of meticulous work, cutting each letter by hand, arranging the layout, gluing everything into place. Verna would have needed a workspace, tools, supplies, storage for completed tiles. His entire home life must have revolved around this production. Imagine his evenings, returning from his day job at the Social Security office, to spend hours hunched over his workbench, cutting out letters, breathing in adhesive fumes, perfecting each tile as if it were a sacred text, being prepared for posterity. And then there was the scouting, the surveillance of roadwork. He would have driven through the city and beyond, noting where crews were repaving, when they worked, when they left. He developed a knowledge of asphalt and its properties, learning exactly how long he could wait before the surface became too hard to accept a tile. This required trial and error, probably some failed installations, certainly a lot of wasted nights waiting for the right moment. The psychological portrait that emerges is one of staggering loneliness, channeled into obsessive purpose. Mental health professionals who later examined the evidence suggested that Verna likely suffered from some form of delusional disorder or schizotypal personality disorder. His ideas, while grounded in real philosophical concepts from Toynbee and real artistic references to Kubrick, had metastasized into a belief system that placed him at the center of an urgent mission to save humanity. He seemed to believe that his message about resurrecting dead molecules on Jupiter through some combination of Toynbee's historical theories was not just interesting, but essential, something the world desperately needed to know. This sense of mission, this conviction that he alone understood something crucial, helped sustain him through years of isolation and labor. Where another person might have sought connection, friendship, love, Verna poured everything into his tiles. They became his relationships, his children, his legacy. Each installation was an act of communication from someone who had largely stopped communicating in normal ways. The tiles said what he could not say in conversation, expressed what he could not express through conventional means. Neighbors were called odd behaviors beyond the nighttime tile installations. Some reported seeing him collecting materials from dumpsters and construction sites, scavenging for linoleum scraps and other supplies. Others mentioned that he would sometimes stand on street corners, just watching traffic flow over the tiles he had installed, perhaps checking to see if they remained intact, perhaps hoping to witness someone stopping to read his message, to finally understand what he was trying to say. The tragedy embedded in Verna's story is the paradox at its heart. He devoted his life to communication, to spreading a message he felt was vitally important, yet he did so while cutting himself off from nearly all human contact. He wanted desperately to be heard, but sacrificed the very relationships that might have satisfied his deeper need for connection. The tiles were both an attempt to reach out and a substitute for reaching out, an artistic mission that became a replacement for the messy, complicated business of actually knowing and being known by other people. There is no evidence that Verna experienced his life as tragic. By all accounts, he seemed driven by a sense of purpose, perhaps even fulfillment in his strange work. But from the outside, the picture is heartbreaking. Here was a man with enough creativity, dedication, and resourcefulness to execute an elaborate multi-decade art project that spanned multiple states and continues to fascinate people decades later. Yet he lived and died in isolation, unknown to his neighbors, disconnected from community, channeling all his human need for meaning and connection into pressing messages into pavement. The tiles themselves became the only lasting evidence of his inner life, the only trace he left that anyone noticed or cared about. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all. Not what the tiles mean or how they were made, but why a human being would choose, or feel compelled, to live this way, to transform loneliness into art and obsession into legacy, to sacrifice everything ordinary for something extraordinary that most people would walk right past without noticing. The tiles began to change sometime in the early 2000s, and those who had followed them for years noticed the shift almost immediately. What had once been enigmatic, but almost poetic messages about resurrection and Jupiter began to fracture, splitting open to reveal something darker underneath. The careful block letters remained, the linoleum carefully cut and pressed into the asphalt, but the words themselves started to twist into accusations, into fragments of paranoia, into the recorded evidence of a mind slowly coming undone. By 2003 or 2004, new tiles appeared that abandoned the original Toynbee riddle entirely. Instead of references to Kubrick or Philadelphia or the movie, these tiles screamed about journalists, about murder, about conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of media control. One tile, discovered on a Philadelphia street corner, read simply, "Journalists killed me." Another, found blocks away, expanded on this theme with rambling text that barely fit the available space. NBC execs covering up Toynbee idea. They know truth, but silence me. Now, the evolution was gradual enough that casual observers might have missed it, but for the dedicated followers who documented every tile they found, the change was unmistakable and deeply troubling. These weren't just new variations on an old theme. These were the writings of someone who believed himself to be under active attack, someone convinced that powerful forces were arrayed against him specifically, working to suppress his message and possibly to end his life. The most disturbing tiles from this period contained references to what Verna called Hellion Jews, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories woven into his broader paranoid tapestry. These weren't dog whistles or subtle implications. They were explicit, ugly accusations that connected Jewish people to the supposed cover-up of his Toynbee idea, to NBC executives he believed were persecuting him, to a vast and nebulous network of enemies working in concert to destroy him. For many who had celebrated the tiles as charming folk art or intriguing urban mystery, these messages represented a breaking point. This was no longer quirky. This was the documentation of hate speech mixed with severe mental illness, baked into the streets themselves. The tiles from this era often appeared more hastily constructed, the letters less precise, the edges more ragged. Some researchers who studied them noted that the quality of installation had degraded as well. Earlier tiles had been carefully pressed into softened asphalt, perfectly flush with the road surface. These later tiles sometimes sat proud of the pavement, their edges already beginning to peel before cars had even driven over them. It was as if the creator's focus had shifted entirely from craft to urgency, from artistry to a desperate need to communicate his fragmenting worldview before time ran out. One tile from around 2006 contained over 100 words crammed into a space that should have held perhaps 30. The text spiraled around itself, accusations bleeding into one another until the message became almost unreadable. It spoke of reporters who had followed him, of cameras hidden in his apartment, of phone lines tapped and neighbors paid to spy. It mentioned specific Philadelphia radio stations by call letters, claiming they broadcast coded messages meant to mock him or drive him further into isolation. The tile ended with a plea that was simultaneously heartbreaking and disturbing. "Someone decode this before they kill me. All of you must resurrect on Jupiter." The tragedy of these later tiles extends beyond their content to their context. James Marasco continued making them, continued gluing linoleum letters to tar paper, continued venturing out in the pre-dawn hours to install them on city streets, all while believing that journalists were hunting him, that vast conspiracies were working to silence him, that his life was in imminent danger. And he did all of this knowing, on some level, that almost no one understood what he was trying to say. Think about that for a moment. The core of the Toynbee tile mystery had always been the question of why someone would create such elaborate messages without any clear explanation, without signing their work, without providing context that would help viewers understand. But by the 2000s, that question had taken on a much darker dimension. Verna wasn't creating art for an audience. He was screaming into a void that had never answered back and never would. Every tile represented hours of work, cutting the letters from linoleum, arranging them on tar paper, coating everything in glue, storing the finished tiles until he could deploy them, scouting locations, waiting for the right moment when traffic was light enough to allow installation. All of this effort, all of this risk, all of this obsessive dedication in service of messages that passers-by would see for perhaps 2 seconds before driving over them if they noticed them at all. And among those who did notice, how many would actually understand? How many would decode the increasingly fractured references to connect them back to Arnold Toynbee, to Arthur Clarke, to Ray Bradbury, to the original coherent idea that had started all of this? The answer, evidenced by decades of confusion and speculation, was almost none. Verna was utterly alone in his mission, creating elaborate texts in a language only he fully understood, warning about conspiracies that existed only in his deteriorating mental landscape. This raises profound ethical questions that the tile community has grappled with for years. Should we celebrate these creations as outsider art, as the work of an untrained artist creating something genuinely unique and culturally significant? Or should we mourn them as the visible symptoms of untreated psychosis, as evidence of a human being suffering without adequate care or intervention? The outsider art argument has its proponents. The tiles are undeniably compelling, strange enough to capture imagination, while remaining just coherent enough to invite interpretation. They've inspired documentaries, websites, pilgrimages by tile hunters who travel to cities specifically to find and photograph them. In purely aesthetic terms, they represent a form of expression that exists nowhere else, a genuinely original contribution to the landscape of urban folk art. Some argue that Verna's mental illness, while tragic, was inseparable from his creative drive, that pathologizing his work diminishes both the art and the artist. But this perspective becomes harder to maintain when confronted with the specific content of the later tiles. The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the paranoid accusations against journalists, the increasingly disconnected grammar and syntax that suggest not artistic choice but cognitive fragmentation. These aren't the marks of outsider genius. They're symptoms. They're the readable evidence of a man who needed help he apparently never received, who channeled his deteriorating mental state into a project that consumed his life without ever providing the connection or understanding he desperately sought. Some researchers who studied Verna in his final years reported disturbing encounters. One journalist who tracked him down in the mid-2000s described a man who wouldn't make eye contact, who spoke in rapid whispers about enemies closing in, who seemed to exist in a state of constant fear. The tiles, for him, weren't art or mystery. They were survival. They were his attempt to warn the world before the conspiracies he believed in finally silenced him. Consider the profound isolation this represents. Verna had apparently alienated his family, lost his job, withdrawn from normal social contact. His entire focus had narrowed to the tiles and the imagined persecution he faced. He lived alone with his beliefs, his accusations, his fear, creating message after message that the world either ignored or misunderstood. No one was listening. Not really. And on some level, he must have known this. The tiles from 2008 and 2009 show further deterioration. The messages became more fragmented, more accusatory, more disconnected from any coherent narrative. References appeared to events that no one else remembered, to people whose names meant nothing to researchers who tried to track them down, to conspiracies so baroque and specific that they could only exist in one man's mind. And then, sometime around 2011, the original tiles stopped appearing. New installations ceased. The last definitively attributed Toynbee tile created by James Marasco was documented in Philadelphia in late 2010 or early 2011, though the exact date remains disputed. After that, nothing. The most likely explanation is the simplest and saddest. James Marasco died. Whether from natural causes, suicide, or the accumulated toll of years living in paranoid fear and social isolation, he almost certainly passed away around 2011. He died as he had lived in his final years, alone and unnoticed, his passing marked by silence rather than obituary. No death certificate has been found, at least not one that researchers have been able to definitively connect to the tile maker. No grave has been located. No official record confirms his end. He simply stopped making tiles, and the most reasonable interpretation is that he stopped because he could no longer continue. Because he was gone. In the years since, copycat tiles have appeared in various cities, created by admirers or artists inspired by the original mystery. But those who have studied the tiles extensively can tell the difference. The copies lack something essential, some quality of obsessive precision mixed with deteriorating coherence that mark the genuine articles. They're tributes or homages, but they're not the same. The real tiles, the ones created by a man who believed in them completely, who structured his entire existence around placing them, who saw in them both salvation and desperate warning, those tiles are finished. They remain only as archaeological evidence, slowly being destroyed by traffic and time, their messages fading back into the pavement that holds them. What remains is the question of how we should remember them, and him, as mystery or tragedy, as art or symptom, as the work of an unrecognized genius, or the visible manifestation of suffering that no one addressed. Perhaps the answer is that they're all of these things simultaneously, that we don't have to choose. The tiles can be culturally significant and compelling, while also being heartbreaking evidence of mental illness. We can appreciate their mystery while mourning the isolation of their creator. We can recognize both the creativity involved in their construction and the pain that drove their increasingly desperate messages. What we cannot do is ignore the darkness at the heart of this story. The Toynbee Tiles aren't a harmless urban legend. They're the record of a human being slowly losing himself to paranoid delusion, spending the last years or decades of his life in service to a mission that no one else understood, warning about threats that didn't exist, shouting into a void that never once shouted back. In the months following James Verna's disappearance in 23, something unexpected began appearing on sidewalks across South Philadelphia. New tiles, fresh installations bearing the familiar technique of tar paper, linoleum, and asphalt adhesive, pressed into the pavement with the same careful methodology that Verna had perfected over decades. But these tiles were different. They lacked the frantic urgency, the apocalyptic warnings, the desperate misspellings that characterized the original work. These new creations featured artistic flourishes, clean lettering, even deliberate design elements that suggested someone had studied Verna's technique, not as a compulsion, but as a craft to be mastered. The first confirmed copycat tiles appeared in Center City, Philadelphia in 2004, just months after the last authenticated Verna tiles were discovered. These imitations honored the original style while adding their own messages. Some referenced pop culture, others political commentary, a few simply celebrated the act of guerrilla art itself. The craftsmanship was often superior to Verna's deteriorating later work. The letters were straighter, the spacing more deliberate, the overall presentation more visually appealing. Tourists would photograph these tiles thinking they had found original Verna installations, unable to distinguish between the paranoid scrawls of a troubled mind and the deliberate homages of street artists. By 2006, copycat tiles had spread to over 30 cities worldwide. Artists in Buenos Aires, London, Rio de Janeiro, and Prague were creating their own versions, each adding local flavor while maintaining the core technique. Some signed their work with pseudonyms, others remained completely anonymous. The copycat phenomenon raised uncomfortable questions that rippled through art communities and among those who had studied Verna's work for years. Were these admirers honoring a unique artistic vision, or were they exploiting the mental deterioration of a man who had created his tiles not as art, but as warnings he genuinely believed could save humanity from catastrophic destruction? The distinction matters because Verna never considered himself an artist. Interviews with a few people who encountered him during his active years paint a picture of someone consumed by genuine terror. He spoke urgently about the visions he experienced, the prophetic dreams that woke him in the middle of the night. His tiles were not creative expression, but emergency broadcasts, messages he felt compelled to spread before time ran out. The copycat artists, by contrast, approached the medium with artistic intention, with aesthetic choices and design philosophy. They created tiles because they found the medium interesting, not because they believed civilization hung in the balance. Museum curators and outsider art specialists began wrestling with how to categorize this phenomenon. The Philadelphia Folk Art Museum acquired several authenticated Verna tiles in 2007, displaying them alongside contextual information about his mental state and the paranoid beliefs that drove his work. The exhibition text carefully noted that Verna likely suffered from untreated schizophrenia, that his tiles represented symptom rather than intention. But visitors still responded to the work aesthetically, appreciating the bold lettering and mysterious messages without fully processing the psychological anguish behind them. The commodification of Verna's legacy accelerated rapidly. Collectors began paying thousands of dollars for authenticated original tiles, creating a black market that encouraged theft. Property owners who once complained about vandalism now found themselves with potentially valuable art embedded in their sidewalks. In 2008, a Verna tile was carefully extracted from a Philadelphia intersection and sold at auction for $8,000. The buyer was a private collector who installed it in their home gallery, removing the tile from its intended context entirely. Verna had placed that specific tile in that specific location because he believed it marked an important coordinate, a place where his warning needed to be seen. Now, it decorated a wealthy person's private collection, transformed from urgent message into aesthetic object. Documentary filmmakers discovered the Verna story around 2009, recognizing its compelling blend of mystery, art, and mental illness. 3 separate documentaries were produced between 2009 and 2012, each telling essentially the same story with slight variations in emphasis. These films brought Verna's work to wider audiences, introducing people who would never visit Philadelphia to the haunting messages embedded in city streets. The documentaries walked an ethical tightrope, trying to present Verna's mental health struggles with sensitivity, while still emphasizing the mysterious and engaging aspects of his story. Viewers came away entertained, moved, and curious. But the question remained whether broadcasting the delusions of a mentally ill person to mass audiences constituted exploitation, regardless of how respectfully it was presented. Articles proliferated in art magazines, psychology journals, and pop culture websites. Each writer approached the story from different angles, but all contributed to transforming Verna from person into legend. The real man, whoever he actually was, became obscured beneath layers of interpretation, speculation, and artistic analysis. Some articles romanticized his isolation, presenting him as a misunderstood genius too pure for conventional society. Others focused clinically on his symptoms, diagnosing him posthumously with various conditions. Few acknowledged the uncomfortable reality that Verna's tiles might not carry any deeper meaning at all, that they might simply be the manifestations of disordered thinking that caused him tremendous suffering. Urban legend tourism embraced the Toynbee Tiles as a destination attraction. Walking tours in Philadelphia began including tile locations on their routes, guides explaining the basic mystery to groups of visitors holding smartphones, photographing the installations for social media. Local bars created Toynbee tile-themed cocktails. T-shirt vendors sold merchandise featuring reproductions of the cryptic messages. The tiles that Verna created in desperate urgency, believing he was warning humanity about impending doom, had become quirky tourist attractions, photo opportunities, symbols of Philadelphia's eccentric charm. The transformation was complete and deeply unsettling. Preservation efforts added another layer of complexity to the ethical questions. Street art preservationists argued that Verna's tiles represented important cultural artifacts that deserved protection. Several tiles were carefully removed from streets, scheduled for repaving, and relocated to museums or protected locations. The Philadelphia Streets Department, once hostile to the installations, began unofficially working around certain tiles during infrastructure repairs. But preserving someone's psychotic break as cultural heritage feels different than preserving their intentional artistic output. Would Verna have wanted his desperate warnings treated as museum pieces? Did his lack of consent, his inability to control how his work was interpreted and displayed, constitute a violation even if the preservation was well-intentioned? The copycat artists complicated matters further by creating what some called second-generation tiles that deliberately mimicked Verna's deteriorating style. These weren't clean artistic homages, but careful forgeries designed to appear authentic. Collectors struggled to authenticate tiles, creating a cottage industry of experts who claimed they could distinguish real Verna tiles from skilled imitations. The irony was thick. Verna's work, created without any concept of artistic value or authenticity, had spawned an authentication industry concerned with provenance and monetary worth. His messages about societal collapse were now investments, their value determined by whether his hands had actually placed them. Some mental health advocates objected to the entire phenomenon, arguing that celebrating Verna's tiles inherently romanticized untreated mental illness. They pointed out that schizophrenia and paranoid delusions cause immense suffering, that presenting Verna as a mysterious outsider artist, rather than a troubled person who needed help, sent dangerous messages about mental health treatment. Young artists began emulating not just Verna's technique, but his outsider status, viewing mental illness as authenticity, rather than as genuine suffering requiring care. The aesthetic appreciation of his work could not be separated from the conditions that produced it, yet that separation was exactly what galleries and documentaries attempted. Others defended the artistic legacy, arguing that Verna's intentions didn't diminish the cultural impact of his work. They noted that many celebrated artists throughout history struggled with mental illness, that the art they produced during those struggles still held value and meaning independent of their psychological state. The tiles exist regardless of why they were created. People respond to them emotionally and aesthetically. Dismissing them entirely because they originated from disordered thinking seemed to some critics like a different form of exploitation, denying Verna any legacy at all by reducing his entire output to mere symptoms. The tension between these positions remains unresolved. Walking through Philadelphia today, you might encounter 3 different types of tiles within a few blocks. Original Verna installations, faded and crumbling, their paranoid messages barely legible after years of traffic and weather. Artistic copycat tiles, vibrant and well-crafted, paying homage to the original concept while transforming it into something new. And careful forgeries, created to deceive, to extract value from the mystery that Verna never intended to create. All 3 exist in the same physical space, telling different stories about art, exploitation, mental illness, and cultural memory. The uncomfortable truth is that these questions may not have satisfying answers. Verna's legacy exists in multiple simultaneous states. His tiles are both art and symptom, both cultural artifact and evidence of suffering. The copycat tiles both honor and exploit, both preserve and distort. The documentaries both educate and commodify. The collectors both appreciate and profit. Perhaps the most honest response is to hold these contradictions simultaneously, to acknowledge that something can be culturally valuable while also being ethically complicated, that we can study and preserve Verna's work while also recognizing the troubling circumstances that produced it. We know who he was. We've put a name to the face, a biography to the mystery. James Edward Verna, a man whose life we can trace through documents and records, and scattered memories of those who crossed his path, but knowing who doesn't answer the questions that truly haunt us. In some ways, it only deepens them. Consider his conspiracy theories, those rambling manifestos about molecular resurrection and coded messages embedded in the fabric of reality itself. We dismiss them as delusion, the fractured logic of a mind coming undone. But what triggered that specific paranoia? What happened to James Verna that made him believe the universe was trying to communicate through him? Was there a moment, a specific event that broke something fundamental in his perception of reality? Or did he glimpse something the rest of us are too blind to see? We'll never know. Whatever key would unlock that mystery died with him. And that brings us to perhaps the most unsettling question of all. What happened to James Verna after 2011? The tiles stopped appearing. The message ceased. Did he simply run out of resources, the money for adhesive, and travel finally exhausted? Or did he die, alone in some anonymous room, his body discovered days or weeks later by a landlord seeking overdue rent? Did anyone mourn him? Did anyone besides the few researchers who eventually pieced together his identity even notice he was gone? The silence that followed his last known tile is absolute. It swallows every answer. We can confirm some collaborators existed. The handwriting analysis proves it. The geographic spread demands it. But who were they? How did he find them, these fellow travelers willing to embed cryptic tiles in cities across continents? Were they true believers in his resurrection theory, or simply lonely souls who found purpose in his mission? They remain ghosts, unnamed and unidentified. Perhaps they're still out there, carrying the secret of those strange nights spent pressing tiles into sidewalks, watching strangers step over their work without a glance. But the question that cuts deepest is this: what did James Verna truly believe would happen? Did he think his molecular resurrection theory would actually work? That scattering these messages worldwide would somehow preserve consciousness beyond death? Did he believe he was saving humanity, offering us a blueprint for immortality that we were too foolish to recognize? Or in his quietest moments, did he know it was all delusion? Just a framework to give meaning to the compulsion that drove him? Was he simply documenting his own fragmenting thoughts, creating the illusion of purpose to mask the reality of his isolation? We've solved the mystery of who created the Toynbee Tiles, but we haven't solved why it matters, why it haunts us, why we can't simply file it away as an odd footnote in urban history. Perhaps because in Verna's lonely crusade, we recognize something uncomfortably human. The desperate need to be heard, to matter, to leave some mark that proves we existed. And so the tiles remain. Hundreds of them, embedded in asphalt and concrete in cities across the world. Philadelphia and New York, Boston and Washington, scattered across South America. Millions of people step over them every day, eyes fixed on phones or the middle distance, never looking down, never seeing the message pressed into the ground beneath their feet. A lonely man's words that reached everywhere and reached nowhere simultaneously. A monument to isolation that masqueraded as connection. James Verna spoke to the world, and the world walked on by, unseeing. The tiles are fading now, worn away by traffic and weather and time. One day, perhaps soon, the last one will disappear entirely, ground to dust under the weight of footsteps. And then even the physical evidence of his existence will be gone, leaving only questions that echo in the silence. Questions that will never be answered. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.